The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most misunderstood clashes in modern history, largely because both Israelis and Palestinians live within their own narratives. Both sides see themselves as indigenous to the land, but that's where the similarity ends. For Israelis, it's a story of an exiled people returning to their homeland and controlling their own destiny. For Palestinians, it's a story of outsiders taking over their land, displacement, erasure, and an ongoing occupation. So what is the real history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Jews and Muslims have both lived on this tiny strip of land for millennia. But the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict has its roots in the late 1800s, back when the region called Palestine was a small province within the greater Ottoman Empire. A steady trickle of Jews had migrated here for centuries, fulfilling an enduring yearning for the biblical land of Israel. In the 1880s, this migration accelerated when Jews living in Eastern Europe began fleeing deadly rampages called pogroms. Some crossed the Atlantic or went to other parts of Europe, but others were driven by growing idealism to return to their ancient Jewish homeland and build a new Jewish society for the modern world. This idealism was the early expression of a new movement called Zionism. The leader of this movement was Theodor Herzl. Influenced by the creation of new nation-states across Europe and fed up with entrenched anti-Semitism, Herzl dreamed of establishing a state where Jews would control their own destiny. He and his supporters envisioned this new state in Palestine, the site of the ancient Jewish homeland. But as support for Zionism grew and more European Jewish refugees immigrated to Palestine, the local Arab population became increasingly resentful. The Arabs viewed the Jews as unwanted colonialists, even though these Jewish immigrants had legally purchased the land they were settling. The friction between Jews and Arabs increased after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire dissolved and the British temporarily took control, establishing the British Mandate for Palestine. Some Arabs had hoped to form a unified pan-Arab state that would include the region of Ottoman Palestine. But with territorial lines across the Middle East drawn by the French and the English, the hope of a greater Arab state faded. Many of Mandatory Palestine's Arabs began to rally around a distinct form of Palestinian nationalism that directly clashed with Zionism and resisted British rule. Arab opposition to Zionism also had a religious dimension. Jewish emigration threatened a core Islamic principle, that non-Muslims couldn't possess land once controlled by Muslims. Jews and Arabs were now on a political and religious collision course. Two events in the following years were especially pivotal to the growing struggle, and they foreshadowed the long and bloody conflict to come. The first was a deadly Arab massacre of Palestine's Jews in 1929. The massacre was sparked by a propaganda campaign falsely claiming that Jews were desecrating holy Muslim sites and trying to rebuild the Jewish temple. The second was a 3-year Arab revolt against the British starting in 1936. By 1939, the British had managed to suppress the uprising with the assistance of Palestine's Jewish population, but the harsh British response had devastating consequences for the Arabs. The lucky ones were able to flee, the unlucky were imprisoned, or worse. However, the Arab rebellion was successful in one respect. To appease the Arabs, the British placed several quotas on the number of Jews permitted to emigrate to Palestine. The Jews of Palestine were livid. They'd helped the British quash the Arab rebellion, and now they felt betrayed. Worse, they knew that Jews in Europe were desperate to escape the growing Nazi threat. So some Jewish paramilitary groups turned their sights on the British, initiating a deadly campaign to end British domination in Palestine and allow immigration of Jews fleeing Nazi Europe.
Haifa Harbor, Palestine. An oil fire, admittedly started by terrorists, the so-called Stern Gang, rages along a quarter-mile of waterfront. The timing of the explosions was allegedly to divert British attention away from a refugee ship making for port under cover of darkness.
But it wasn't enough to save European Jewry. 6 million Jews, 1/3 of the world's Jewish population, went up in smoke, lost in the horrors of the Holocaust. As the survivors emerged from the wreckage and the full scale of the Nazi atrocities became clear, Jews around the world became even more convinced of the necessity of a Jewish state, where Jews could protect themselves. A Jewish state probably wouldn't have prevented the atrocities, but it might have minimized the deadly toll. After World War II, the British were done, tired of nearly 30 failed years of mediating between Jews and Arabs, so they handed the responsibility of what should happen next to the United Nations. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly approved a plan to divide the British Mandate for Palestine into a Jewish state of Israel and an Arab state of Palestine.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
The city of Jerusalem, holy to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, would remain under international control for 10 years. According to the plan, by mid-May 1948, the British would be out, and the two new countries would exist side by side. For Jews, this plan was imperfect, but better than nothing. But for Arabs, it was a non-starter. They didn't accept the UN's right to give away what they thought of as their land, and they categorically rejected the idea of a Jewish state at all, threatening, quote, a war of extermination. Within days of the UN vote, Arabs in Mandatory Palestine attacked Jewish communities, sparking a war between the Arabs and Jews while the British looked on. On May 14, 1948, the day before the British mandate officially ended, Zionist leader David Ben-Gurion announced Israel's independence.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
Within 24 hours, Arab armies from 5 countries invaded, hoping to overwhelm the new Jewish state's military force and conquer the land. The Jews were outmanned, but they had one thing the Arabs didn't: unity. And after a year of bitter fighting, the Jewish state had repelled the Arab armies, establishing a fragile truce. At the end of the hostilities, 1% of Israel's Jewish population lay in graves. The Arab fatality count, including Palestinians, was unknown, but some Palestinian leaders claimed it was as high as 12,000 people. Still, Israel's War of Independence was a huge victory for the tiny Jewish state. Now, Israel not only held the territory the UN had allocated for a Jewish state, but it also captured extra land, most notably the western neighborhoods of Jerusalem where most of the city's Jews lived. And here's where the conflict's narratives diverge. For the Palestinians, the outcome was an absolute disaster. The events of 1947 to 1949 became known as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. Thousands had lost their lives. Over 400 Arab villages were left in utter shambles, destroyed and in many cases depopulated. An estimated 700,000 Arabs were now homeless. Many had fled the fighting, while others were forcibly expelled by Israeli troops. Some fled to other Arab countries. Most ended up in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, territories that were part of the UN's proposed Arab state, but which were now under Jordanian and Egyptian control. And some stayed within the Israeli borders, in theory as equal citizens, but in practice forced by Israel's government to live under martial law. For the next 2 decades, Arab countries tried to squeeze Israel by cutting off its access to fuel and water. Palestinian guerrillas called Fedayeen infiltrated Israel's borders dozens of times, taking hundreds of Israeli lives. And in 1967, the Arab state's simmering pressure campaign boiled over into a crisis. Egypt, Jordan, and Syria massed tens of thousands of troops on Israel's borders. Outnumbered and on the brink of annihilation, Israel shocked the world by destroying most of the Egyptian Air Force in a surprise aerial attack. The outcome of this war would change the entire trajectory of the Middle East. Within 6 days, Israel had defeated the Arab armies and captured the Arab-held areas of Jerusalem, as well as the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. But the West Bank and Gaza were already home to 1.2 million Palestinians, many of whom were refugees from 1948. Overnight, Israel was suddenly in charge of this huge and unfriendly population. And because Israel had acquired these territories by force, their status was an open question, so the UN tried to mediate. If Israel returned all the territories, the Arab bloc had to acknowledge Israel's right to exist. except that Arab countries had zero intention of acknowledging Israel. A few months after their defeat in the Six-Day War, Arab leaders met to discuss what to do with the Jewish state. They walked away with a consensus known as the Three No's: no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations with Israel. This position would define the Arab world's relationship to Israel for the next decade. So Israel had minimal motivation to give up these strategic territories. And without the West Bank, Israel's central borders were only 9 miles across, easy for any hostile invaders to cut the country in half. So to bolster its defenses, Israel built a few Jewish communities known as settlements in strategic locations across the West Bank. These communities would be early warning stations for any Arab invasion. For many Israelis, they also represented a miraculous Jewish return to the historic land of the Bible. But for Palestinians, Israeli settlement construction and its military presence in the West Bank was a continuing theft of their land. This sense of injustice reawakened dormant Palestinian nationalism. Disparate Palestinian guerrilla groups united under a charismatic leader named Yasser Arafat and an organization called the Palestine Liberation Organization, originally formed in 1964. Their strategy? Armed struggle until the liberation of Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, meaning a total end to the Jewish state. Meanwhile, resentment over Israel's victory stewed among Arab countries, notably neighboring Egypt and Syria. But Israel didn't believe the Arabs would attack so soon after their major military defeat in 1967. They were wrong.
It is an all-out war. That's how Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan describes an invasion of the Golan Heights and the East Bank of the Suez by Syria and Egypt. The surprise attacks came early this morning in the air and on the ground.
In 1973, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria hit Israel simultaneously, catching Israel completely off guard. Israel suffered heavy losses. Even though it eventually emerged intact, this victory felt more like defeat. Egypt had given Israel a black eye to make up for its humiliation in 1967. Now, they were finally ready for their icy relationship to thaw. Just 6 years after the Yom Kippur War, Israel and Egypt stood on the White House lawn and signed an historic peace agreement. This treaty was the first shift from the wider Arab-Israeli conflict to the narrower Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Palestinian leadership believed that Egypt had betrayed and abandoned them, and if other Arab powers had failed to liberate them, it was time to take matters into their own hands, with force. Led by the PLO, Palestinian militants intensified their terror attacks against Israeli civilians. But rather than break down Israel's defenses, the terror campaign had the opposite effect. In the late 1970s, Israel accelerated the construction of settlements in the West Bank. These communities served to isolate Palestinian villages and make it harder to draw contiguous borders around Palestinian territory, all while making the prospect of a Palestinian state even more unlikely. The ongoing tension between Israel and Palestinians erupted into the First Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, in 1987. Israel's military responded harshly to Palestinian terror. 160 Israelis and over 1,100 Palestinians lost their lives. The First Intifada marked a couple significant changes in the conflict. The first was the emergence of a new Palestinian terror group called Hamas. Its objective was simple, ruthless, and rooted in religious fervor: eliminating Israel completely and replacing it with the Islamist Arab state of Palestine. But while Hamas was bent on destroying Israel completely, the PLO, the de facto Palestinian leadership, shifted to a more pragmatic approach. In 1993, and then again in 1995, after years of secret talks and intense negotiations, the Israeli government and the PLO did the impossible. They signed an agreement called the Oslo Accords, offering mutual recognition and a roadmap for negotiating a permanent peace agreement. It was the first time since Israel's founding that any Palestinian leadership had officially recognized Israel's existence. As an initial step toward eventual Palestinian autonomy, the Oslo Accords established a new political entity called the Palestinian Authority, or the PA. Israel and the PA divided the West Bank into 3 sections, with the PA fully in control of the majority Arab section. As all of this was unfolding, Jordan and Israel also settled their differences, signing a peace agreement in 1994. After nearly 50 years of conflict, it seemed that peace between Israelis, Palestinians, and their neighbors was tantalizingly close. But the Oslo Accords didn't solve every problem. The Palestinians pressed Israel to agree to a so-called right of return for the Palestinian refugees displaced in 1948. The question of refugees had been an open wound for Palestinians for decades. They believed that according to international law, Israel was required to permit the 1948 refugees to return to their former homes inside Israel. And this right also applied to their descendants, who in the early 90s totaled more than 3 million people. Israel rejected this position. They believed that the demand for the right of return was a deliberate attempt to undermine Israel as a Jewish majority state. At the time, Israel was home to about 4.5 million Jews and 1 million Arabs. If the Arab population suddenly quadrupled, Israel's identity as a Jewish majority state would be at risk. So both sides agreed that over the next 5 years, they'd meet again to hammer out tough questions like the refugees and what to do with Jerusalem and the settlements in the West Bank. But the Oslo negotiating process was threatened by extremists on both sides. Hamas initiated a terror campaign to murder and maim Israeli civilians, undermining Israeli confidence that Palestinians were truly interested in or even capable of enforcing peace. And many right-wing Israelis opposed Oslo because they felt it surrendered sacred Jewish land. Extremists whipped their followers into a frenzy, culminating in the assassination of Israel's prime minister by a Jewish extremist. The peace process was quickly put on life support. So, in a last-ditch effort to revive it before he left office, American President Bill Clinton invited Israelis and Palestinians to a peace summit in the summer of 2000. After several rounds of back and forth, Israel agreed to a demilitarized Palestinian state consisting of all of the Gaza Strip, along with 95% of the West Bank, plus land swaps from Israeli territory. But the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat rejected this without offering a counter-proposal, and the two sides couldn't agree on the right of return, or how to share control of Jerusalem. These two sticking points, and Arafat's refusal to entertain the Israeli offer, ground the discussions to a halt. The hope of Oslo was now a failure. The next 5 years saw devastating bloodshed as Palestinians initiated a second uprising. About 1,000 Israelis, mostly civilians, were murdered in terror attacks in buses, restaurants, and shops. Israel struck back in deadly counter-terror operations, resulting in as many as 4,000 Palestinian fatalities. Many more were injured and arrested. The Second Intifada drastically altered reality for both Israelis and Palestinians. The Israeli left had been some of the fiercest advocates for peace with the Palestinians. Now, they were disillusioned and politically weakened. And Palestinians faced a bleak future. To contain the lethal terror threat emanating from the West Bank, Israel began erecting a security barrier. The barrier worked, but it also made life extremely difficult for many ordinary Palestinians, who were sometimes forced to wait for hours to cross into Israel, where they had jobs and extended families. Sometimes they were denied entry into Israel altogether. The two-state solution had been popular at one point. Now, few believed it was possible. But while Israel was determined to keep control of the West Bank, the government's attitude on Gaza had shifted.
האמנתי וקיוויתי שנוכל להיאחז לעד בנצרים ובכפר דרום. אך המציאות המשתנה בארץ, באזור ובעולם, חייבה אותי להערכה אחרת ולשינוי עמדות. לא ניתן להחזיק בעזה לנצח.
Some 9,000 Israeli settlers lived in the Gaza Strip, who were surrounded by roughly 1.4 million Palestinians. The cost to protect the settlers was high, and Israel's military efforts to protect them were sharply criticized abroad. So in 2005, in a move that divided the country, Israel completely dismantled the Jewish settlements and extracted Jewish settlers and the Israeli army from the Gaza Strip. But handing Gaza to the Palestinians wasn't as simple as it seemed. Gazans still dependent on the movement of goods through border crossings tightly controlled by both Egypt and Israel. And Palestinians couldn't agree among themselves on who would be in charge. Hamas won a majority in the Palestinian legislative elections in 2006, but its infighting with rival group Fatah made governing impossible, until Hamas took control of the Strip by force in 2007. Over the next 16 years, Hamas intensified rocket strikes into Israeli territory, firing more than 20,000 rockets at Israeli communities, each one triggering air raid alerts and sending Israelis scrambling into bomb shelters. The group poured its resources into building a vast network of tunnels hundreds of meters underground, enabling them to move their fighters and rockets out of sight of watchful Israeli technology. Israel's attempts to contain Hamas's aggression through airstrikes and occasional ground intrusions yielded only temporary successes. Hamas's grip on the Gaza Strip was firm. Meanwhile, tensions persisted in the West Bank. While the security barrier dramatically lowered the incidence of terror in Israel, Israeli civilians living in the West Bank were not so lucky. In the years following the Second Intifada, hundreds of Israelis were wounded or murdered in terror attacks. For Palestinians, these terror attacks paid. Literally. The Palestinian Authority provided lifetime payments to the families of militants, financially incentivizing them to target Israelis. In response, Israel's government pursued its own interest in cementing its control over the West Bank by building and expanding Jewish settlements. They were undeterred by international bodies that deemed the settlements illegal under international law. Israel disagreed. Palestinians also faced emerging threats from the right-wing Jewish extremists responsible for a wave of aggression against them. But while Israelis and Palestinians lived in an uneasy status quo, cycling between mini-wars and terror attacks and settlement construction, Israel's relationship with the wider Arab world was improving. In 2020, Israel signed the Abraham Accords with 4 Arab states. Even Saudi Arabia seemed like it was about to get on board. But events were about to unfold that would shake Israel and indeed all of the Middle East. Shortly after sunrise on October 7, 2023, thousands of Hamas terror operatives, who were later joined by Palestinian civilians from Gaza, broke through the Gaza border fence, stunning Israel in a vicious and well-planned onslaught. The day turned out to be the bloodiest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. Over 1,100 Israelis, the vast majority of them civilians, were murdered. More Israeli lives were lost in a few hours than in the entire 5 years of the Second Intifada. Israeli communities bordering Gaza were overwhelmed by Hamas fighters who went house to house in a rampage. They targeted partygoers at an overnight music festival, butchering many as they tried to escape. Militants breached secure military bases, slaughtering soldiers and crippling the army's ability to respond to the offensive. As a central part of their attack plan, Hamas operatives dragged 250 captives into Gaza, including women, children, and elderly people. These hostages would play a critical role as the war developed. But in Hamas-controlled Gaza and the Palestinian Authority-controlled West Bank, the onslaught was met with cheering and celebration. The leadership of Fatah, the political organization dominating the Palestinian Authority, praised the attacks as self-defense, and the attackers as heroes who were a source of pride and honor for the Palestinian people. Vowing to root out Hamas once and for all, Israel struck Gaza from the air and mobilized troops for a ground operation. Hundreds of Israeli soldiers went into Gaza only to return in body bags. The war has devastated the Palestinians. The Hamas-controlled health ministry says that the loss of life in Gaza is in the tens of thousands. Israel claims that nearly half of the fatalities were Hamas terror operatives. Most of Gaza's 2 million Palestinians have been displaced, forced into wretched refugee camps where they experience a dire food and water shortage. Much of the infrastructure in Gaza has been reduced to dust and rubble and will take years to rebuild. The damage to both Israeli and Palestinian civil society cuts deep, and it's only reinforced the dueling narratives of the conflict. For Israelis and Jews around the world, October 7th reawakened primal Jewish fears forged by centuries of pogroms and the devastation of the Holocaust. The events of October 7th fit the pattern that many Israelis have come to expect, that Palestinians are bent on the annihilation of Israel, that ceding any territory to Palestinians endangers Israel, that temporary peace only leads to worse consequences. The world will be hard-pressed to convince Israelis that Palestinian independence won't spell further danger. For Palestinians and their supporters around the globe, the destruction unleashed by Israel in Gaza is unforgivable and criminal. They see the war as a mass extermination attempt. And even though some Palestinians do blame Hamas for the chain reaction that followed October 7th, many more blame Israel for the carnage. Today, we are at one of the most difficult points in this long history, and how these two traumatized peoples will pick up the pieces is anyone's guess. But for any lasting peace, both sides need to step out of their narratives, see the other's perspective, validate each other, and find common ground.